From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman, whose personal life has just been scored by the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, and I have to say it's not what he promised.
I just found out that when my divorce goes through next week, 24 million Americans will lose their health insurance. It's a bad settlement.
Bad settlement. And, of course, we have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello.
We're looking forward to today's show because on the show, we're going to talk to Palestinian-American comedian / law professor Amer Zahr and find out what's so funny about peace, love, and understanding, to paraphrase Elvis Costello. We will also be discussing the uplifting story of how the small town of Richmond, California, was able to shake off its dependence on big oil and successfully redefine itself as a thriving, progressive 21st century community. We'll be doing that with author Steve Early, whose book is entitled Refinery Town. We will also, as always, check in with corporate crime reporter Russell Mokiber, the deputy dog of the corporate crime beat. But first, as some of you may know, maybe not from that first little beat we did in the show, that David and I are comedians, and Ralph, of course, is a lawyer. Well, our first guest is both. David?
Amer Zahr is an Arab-American comedian, speaker, writer, academic, and adjunct professor at the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law. He draws on his experiences growing up as a child of Palestinian immigrant parents, performing and lecturing on topics like politics, society, Islam, growing up Arab, and more. He is also the author of the well-read blog, The Civil Arab, as well as his first book, Being Palestinian Makes Me Smile, a collection of his writings relating to being Palestinian. He has performed throughout North America and the Middle East. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Amer Zahr.
Thank you so much, man. It's an honor to be here.
Yes, indeed. Welcome. Just to set the framework for this discussion, because some people out there may think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has very little humor around it. I've often said, in humor there is truth. That's a phrase I didn't create. But I want to read an excerpt from your introduction. And it says, quote, "As a Palestinian, it can be very easy to become consumed by depression and despair. But I have always noticed that laughter and crying are not as different as they might seem. We have all seen people laugh so hard that they begin to cry. But have you ever seen people cry so hard that they begin to laugh? I have. See? Not that different." End quote. For people who don't know the briefest history, the UN, with the U.S. in the lead in 1948, declared the State of Israel. They partitioned Palestine, and the part that was Israel was a smaller part of Palestine. And very soon after that, the Israelis took over the Negev Desert, which more than doubled their size, and there remained the West Bank and Gaza with Palestinians living there. And increasingly, as the disparity in military power came to the Israeli side at a very, very high level, there were occasional wars and conflicts, often regular invasions into the West Bank. They're called incursions. And now there are 5 million Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in Israel proper. And there are not that many more Israelis. There's probably 5 or 6 million Israelis. And this has been a continuing conflict. There are UN resolutions demanding that Israel withdraw to the 1967 borders, but they have not been observed. With that background, Amer, tell us how you got out of Michigan Law School. Instead of becoming a practicing lawyer, you became a comedian that talked serious, that talked funny, and you appeared in clubs around the country. You've been in Palestine and other areas. How did this come about?
Well, before I say that, let me just say this is a really great honor. As an Arab American growing up in suburban Philadelphia, and my parents were activists, their whole life because they're Palestinian. That's what we do. And there were a few names that popped up in our house all the time when we were being told how we need to become good Arab Americans. And those were names like Edward Said, Casey Kasem, and Ralph Nader. And so it is really like an honor. I mean, to hear you read stuff from my book, it's like, I got to tell my mom right when we get off the phone. I got to call my mom and tell her what happened. So it's a real honor. But look, I was in law school at the University of Michigan, and there was a student group bringing in an Arab American comedian. And this is about 2004, maybe, or about 2003 or 4. And he was coming by himself, and so they kind of asked around the community if there was anybody that just wanted to get up and just sort of fill some time, because they wanted to fill some time on the stage. So I've always loved to tell stories here and there. I got on stage. I was pretty nervous. I told a few stories about my dad and how he can't handle voicemail whenever he calls my phone, and people laughed. And I kind of got hooked to this idea of talking on stage and people laughing at what you say. And so I just kind of kept working on it. I got done law school, and when I finished law school, I said to myself, well, I can go try to become a comedian, or I can go try to become a lawyer. And if I go try to become a lawyer, I'll probably never try this comedian stuff. So let me try the comedian stuff, and if I fail, I'll go become a lawyer. But it's been 12 years, or 13 years actually, and now I've been doing it full time. I didn't make any money for the first 3 or 4 years. My parents were pretty mad. And then, I finally bought a house, and they said, oh, my son is a comedian. So, things are going well now, and I've been able to travel around the world. I've started a comedy festival at the Arab American Museum in Dearborn that's gone on for 4 years now. I've started a comedy festival in Palestine, in Ramallah, Jerusalem, and Bethlehem for a week in every August. That's gone on for a couple years now, and I've been lucky enough to perform at the Kennedy Center and Carnegie Hall, and so it's been a really great journey. And look, tragedy sometimes leads to the best comedy, and the experiences of oppressed people, whether they're Palestinian or Black or Latino or whatever they are, leads to this, and actually a strong tradition of it coming from Jewish comedians many, many years ago, really leads to sort of getting into somebody's heart and seeing where humor meets tragedy. And I think that's sort of the best sort of storytelling.
Well, in your book, Being Palestinian Makes Me Smile, Amer, you have a lot of short essays, and one that stood out was titled Bibi Entertains Us at the UN, and you wrote it September 29th, 2012. Bibi referring to Prime Minister Netanyahu, that's his nickname in Israel. What are your thoughts on that event?
Well, I mean, look, this was when he went to the UN and held up the picture of the bomb and said, this is a bomb and this is a fuse. Israelis aren't really, I'm sure we all remember that moment, where he's in the UN. It's the General Assembly meeting of the UN. He's talking about Iran. He's obsessed with Iran. So he's talking about Iran, and he holds up eventually this like Roadrunner picture of a bomb with like it's just a circle with a line coming out of it. And he says, this is a bomb and this is a fuse. And he's talking about Iran. Now, I can tell you as an Arab Palestinian, that is not what a bomb looks like. Okay. And
unless it's a cartoon.
Yeah. I mean, he has this obsession with us as Palestinians. He has an obsession with Islam more than ISIS even. He talks about it all the time. He calls us a demographic threat as Palestinians, which he's right about. I mean, we have like triple the birth rate of the normal human being. Look, I actually think, if I'm an optimistic person, which I am, that he's going to bring us liberation. I mean, we Palestinians don't get to liberation through negotiations like the Oslo Agreement. We don't get to liberation through some goodwill on the part of the Israelis or their ideology. We get to liberation through actually Israel becoming as right-wing as it can become and deciding to sort of imperialistically swallow up all the land, which looks like they might do now in the West Bank and maybe even in Gaza one day because they found gas there, and kind of take us all in and then have to finally answer the question of what are you going to do with these people? And I think that's the way we get to real liberation, one state in all of Palestine. And I actually think Bibi's going to take us there. I really do. And Trump is helping him along. In a weird way, Trump and Netanyahu might liberate Palestine, not on purpose, but just because, they really don't know what the hell they're doing. So they might take a step.
The majority of Palestinians and Israelis, even now, are for a two-state solution. But the one-state solution advocates have been on the rise. And just to break the stereotype, we have Israeli soldiers objecting to the destruction in Gaza. They formed a group called Breaking the Silence. We have over 1,500 Israeli reserves who fought in the wars, putting out a dramatic proclamation a number of years ago saying that they will never fight in the West Bank and Gaza. They'll fight to defend Israel, but they will not fight to oppress and abuse an occupied people. You have the great human rights group, B'Tselem, has defended Palestinian human rights. You have, this is a remarkable poll. This was an Israeli university about 8-9 years ago, had a poll, and over 60% of the Israelis said that Israel should negotiate with Hamas, and only about 29% said no. I go through all these because we got to break the stereotype here that there's just one voice here. There are a lot of retired heads of the Israeli FBI and CIA who have spoken out publicly against the right-wing government run by Prime Minister Netanyahu, but none of them have ever been invited to testify in Congress. The most remarkable thing here is there's a lot of dissent in Israel that never gets a voice in Congress. Just the AIPAC right-wing militaristic view gets a voice. Now, having said all that, why have you now become, if I'm not mistaken, a one-stater?
I always was. I mean, I actually remember, I was a teenager, but I actually remember a New York Times column by Edward Said back in the early 90s talking about a one-state solution even before Oslo. I think it's the only just solution. I mean, look, as a Palestinian, I am not willing to sort of settle for 22% of my native homeland, of mandate Palestine. Look, we call ourselves Palestinian because of these lines that were drawn first sort of roughly by Ottomans and then by the British of what we now call Palestine, which is the whole thing, West Bank, Gaza, and Israel. And here's the funny thing, right? If you ask a Palestinian to draw his country, or if he's wearing a pendant of his country around his neck, it's the whole thing. It's the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and Israel. If you ask an Israeli to draw his country, he draws the same thing. So emotionally, psychologically, we're all talking about the same piece of land. And as Palestinians, we identify as Palestinians throughout all of that land, whether we still live there or whether we're refugees. So if I'm interested in uniting Palestinians in our identity, if I'm interested in making sure all Palestinians who live on that land have rights and have the same rights, well, the only way there is a one-state solution. And it kind of solves all the problems, right? If you ended the occupation tomorrow, and even if the Palestinians got a state in the West Bank on 1967 borders, which they're not going to under any Israeli regime, but even if they did, then you next have the problem of what do you do about the Palestinians who live in Jerusalem, who are stateless, who pay Israeli taxes but don't vote in Israeli national elections? What do you do about them? And then if you solve that problem, then you still have the Palestinians who live inside Israel who have full citizenship on paper, but are treated as second or third class citizens by the state. Their schools get 1/3 of the funding as Jewish schools do. So that's where you have the real actual apartheid happening legally. Occupation can't be apartheid yet because it's still occupation. I mean, it's so you solve all these problems with one state. Settlements aren't settlements anymore. They become part of a state. Jerusalem is not disputed anymore. It becomes the capital of this new state. You don't have to change anything. The place sort of functions as one state anyway. The currency and the financial systems are the same in Gaza, West Bank, and Israel. Everyone uses the shekel. Everyone uses Israeli financial institutions. The infrastructure is the same. Palestinian cell phone companies that operate, quote unquote, independently in the West Bank are buying their bandwidth from Israel because Israel owns the bandwidth everywhere. It owns the resources everywhere. So, I mean, this gets to true justice. The only hurdle is the Israeli ideology that says this land belongs to Jews and Jews only, or at least Jews foremostly. And that is an ideology that when you're talking in the framework of a two-state solution, you don't have to really confront. In fact, in many ways, you are accepting it. And what I'm saying is I don't accept that ideology. that says any inch of that land belongs to one religion or one ethnic group over another. I believe in a secular state. I believe in a democratic state. And, you can call it Israel, Palestine. I don't really care. I mean, Palestine kind of sounds like a Jewish name to me anyway. So you can kind of call it anything you want. I don't really care. Call it the Holy Land, call it the Holy Federation, call the whole thing Jerusalem. I'm interested in rights for my people. And the way that I get there is one state.
We're talking with Amer Zahr, who's written a book called Being Palestinian Makes Me Smile. And what do you think that one state proposal would poll among Palestinians and among Israeli Jews?
I think among Israeli Jews it would probably poll pretty low, because this is sort of runs counter to the ideology, the founding ideology of Zionism, which says this land belongs to Jews and Jews only. But I go to Palestine all the time, okay? I actually am from Nazareth, like Jesus. That's what I tell white people, Ralph. I tell white people I am from Nazareth like Jesus, because too many Americans think that Jesus had blonde hair and blue eyes and he's from South Carolina. That's not true. Actually, Jesus probably kind of looked like you, Ralph. So I always tell people that. In fact, I think as Palestinians, we should be using Jesus like much more in all our marketing. Like everything that has to do with Palestine should have a picture of Jesus on it. He's the most famous man in the history of the world. We should use him a little more often. And his mom is the most famous woman in the history of the world for doing what she did or what she didn't do, or, we don't really know. But in any case, we should use these people much more often. But I think that if you talk to Palestinians, I talk to Palestinians. I'm a Palestinian. I'm from Nazareth. I actually am from a town that is inside Israel. But I go to Ramallah, Bethlehem, Jerusalem. I do shows. I'm there all the time. If you have private conversations with Palestinians and you say to them, look, if tomorrow all these borders and checkpoints and these fences were gone and you could travel throughout the land of Israel or Palestine or whatever you want to call it freely, work where you want, have freedom of movement, but your passport said Israel on it, would you be okay with that? Publicly, for nationalistic reasons and for political reasons, a lot of people might not say it, but privately, everyone is okay with it. That is what we want. We want that freedom. Our problem is not with Jews living in our land or living in Palestine. Our problem is with an ideology that says this land is for Jews and Jews only. That's what we want to do away with. And in fact, it's funny because as a Palestinian, I deal with this all the time. And I also wrote right after the introduction that you read, Ralph, the next paragraph sort of says sarcastically, also, I do not hate Jews. And as a Palestinian, I feel like we need to say this all the time, right? Because the discourse is dominated by Jews and Muslims hate each other. Jews and Palestinians hate each other. So it's intractable. And Palestinians just hate Jews. They're raised to hate Jews. And I was kind of sort of reminded of this sentiment among us, not reminded of it, but it was funny when Trump a couple of weeks ago, remember when he was having that terrible press conference that he kind of came in and decided he wanted to run a press conference. And he said, I'm the least anti-Semitic person you can know, which is a kind of weird way to frame, something. I mean, why not just say you're not anti-Semitic, but whatever. Say I'm the least anti-Semitic. And then I thought of us as Palestinians, and I said, actually, you know what? We're the least anti-Semitic people. Because the truth is, as you said, Ralph, we are familiar with all of these left-wing, liberal Jewish organizations that express justice for Palestinians. Sure, we're familiar with Netanyahu and Lieberman and Bennett and these right-wingers that want to take away all our rights. But we're also very familiar with the left-wingers. And we see Jews march with us. And we see Jews in the West Bank showing solidarity with us. And so what happens as a result of that is, in fact, we are much more privy to the great range of Jewish opinion on Palestine than anybody else. And so as an Arab American, you're telling, isn't it ironic that you, Ralph, as an Arab American, are trying to educate the American public about the diversity of Jewish opinion on Israel? See, we know about it. Nobody else knows about it. And so we don't see all Jews as evil, or all, this sort of anti-Semitic label that we get is so inaccurate, and in fact is a divorce from the reality that we live. We live with liberal Jews and Jews expressing justice about us all the time. The reverse is not true.
Well, there's some very candid major figures in Israeli history as well. Ben-Gurion, who's viewed as the father of modern Israel, said very prominently in an often reported quote about the founding of Israel, he said about the Palestinians, it was their land and we took it. And there are very candid statements by leading Israelis throughout the last 60 years about how this all came about. So let's go to your comedic dimension, and let's start with one of the speeches that Prime Minister Netanyahu made to a joint session of Congress. It wasn't the one in 1996 where he said that it was coming very soon, the end of U.S. aid to Israel, because Israel's a modern, productive, prosperous economy. That was 1996. And then he negotiated with Barack Obama a $38 billion 10-year U.S. aid package to Israel. It's always good to remember history. But he once spoke to a joint session of Congress. He got 29 standing ovations, leading some comedian to say, maybe this should be put in an exercise video for members of Congress every morning. What was your observation on that one?
Well, to paraphrase Shakespeare, they doth applaud too much. I mean, when somebody gets up and applauds every few seconds, it kind of seems fake. It's kind of like getting complimented too much. You start to think it's weird. It's obviously, look, I mean, the Israeli lobby is strong, but it's not based on justice or shared values like people say. It's based on pressure. It's based on fear. And in fact, it's based on also the Israeli lobby has employed for decades Islamophobic tropes to get through to people in Congress and to get through the American public. I think that because it's so fake, right, because it's not based on any sort of values, that it can be changed pretty quickly. And in fact, I've started to learn as a Palestinian that sort of stuff doesn't matter to me anymore. Netanyahu coming and speaking to Congress, I mean, he's wildly more popular in Washington than he is in Israel. And coming and speaking and getting all those standing ovations, that doesn't bother me as a Palestinian anymore. It used to bother me, but it doesn't bother me anymore because as I go to Palestine all the time, I realize that all that really matters is what's happening in Palestine. And what's happening in Palestine are things that the Israelis can't control. First and foremost is us, right? I mean, we talk about back in 1948. If you go back to 1948, the Israelis kicked out lots and lots of Palestinians from what is today Israel. My dad was one of them. He became a refugee in Jordan. And they kicked out about 750,000 Palestinians. However, about 150,000 Palestinians remained in what is today Israel. Now, if those 150,000 Palestinians, if they grew after 69 years at the normal average population growth rate of the world, they should be today about 450 to 500,000 people. However, they are 1.7 million people. All right. We are a demographic threat, proudly. And that has been one of our agendas. We don't have weapons. OK, we don't have tanks. We don't have helicopters. But we do have the Palestinian reproductive system is a very, very, very powerful weapon. I always say that they drop bombs and we drop babies. OK. My parents are like sometimes seen as a small family. We're 4 kids. That's a small Arab family, as Ralph knows. That's not a big family. People say when you have 4 kids, people say, what's wrong with you? Why are you only having 4 kids? And I think what's America, 2.1 or whatever, how many kids you're supposed to have? It is different for us. That is how we resist. 9 months after every war in Gaza, the hospitals are full. People are having babies. When people cannot work, when the lights are off, when they don't have any opportunity, when they don't have freedom of movement, well, guess what they do? All right. And so that is something that Israel can't control. In fact, demographics are destiny in Israel. When you look at the Israeli population, the Israeli Jewish population, all right, already 20% of the Israeli population is Palestinian non-Jews. But what happened over the years is that Israel started out as this sort of like European white supremacist sort of thing, but there wasn't enough of them. So then they brought Arab Jews in 49 and 50 from Iraq, Yemen, Tunisia, Morocco, and a lot came from Iran. Well, those people came. Those people don't really fit into the Zionist ideal. And what's happened now after 60 years is that they're reverting to their culture. So a lot of Israelis are Arabs who are Jews who are speaking Arabic in their households now. And they're singing Arabic music at their weddings. And eating hummus. And they're allowed to eat hummus. They're allowed to say hummus belongs to them. All right. The ones from Europe aren't, but they are. And then you have Ethiopian Israelis who are a small amount of the population, but still speaking a lot of their native language. Then you had Israel still didn't have enough people and brought 1 million Russians in the 90s. And they have now come to Israel. And the Israelis told them, look, if you have one grandparent who's Jewish, you can come. And they came, 1 million of them, because it was the fall of the Soviet Union. Economy was really bad. They came, they got a job and a house. Now they've been in Israel for a generation. Well, guess what they're doing, Ralph? They are building churches now. They're marrying Arab Christians. They are being buried in Arab Christian cemeteries because guess what? They're not, a lot of them aren't Jews. They're Russian Orthodox. That's their culture. That's who they are. So this whole identity thing of Israel being a Jewish only state doesn't exist in reality. The land has been Arab for 1,500 years. That is a hard thing to fight against. And as Ralph knows, being Arab is like contagious. All right. Like when I always see it all the time in America, when an Arab marries a non-Arab, especially if they marry a white person, the Arab doesn't become more white. All right. The white person becomes one of us. That's the way it works. We're very contagious. They might have been living their nice, peaceful sort of white life, just not worrying about anything. And then they marry one of us, and all of a sudden they're dancing in circles. They're kissing other men. They are, find out that they have 35 cousins they never heard of. All of a sudden someone shows up and stays at your house for 3 weeks. I mean, it's different. They become us. And so that happened in Palestine too. The culture is contagious and it's in the land. You can't do anything about it. And Jerusalem, I don't know if you've ever been to Jerusalem, Ralph, but if you go to the old city of Jerusalem, still to this day, after 70 years of Israel and after 50 years of military occupation inside Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem is about 90% Arab still. And if you don't want to get cheated doing business in the old city of Jerusalem, well, guess what language you have to speak? Arabic. And that is the culture of the land, all right? And there's nothing wrong with that. And that, I think, is eventually going to win out, and we already see it happening. So if Israel really wants to move forward, and if Israel wants to remain a place where it can say it's a democracy and it can say it's a safe place for Jews, because ironically right now Israel is probably the most dangerous place for Jews on the planet, not the safest, then it has to become a democracy in a secular way. All right. And you will find very quickly that Palestinians don't have a problem with that. Jews are not foreign to us. Israel is what foreign to us, not Jews.
Well, listen, what if we're in a nightclub and you come on the stage as a comedian? How do you make us laugh on these subjects?
Well, I mean, I have to talk about the ridiculousness of it, right? I have to talk about being Palestinian, sometimes what happens to me. Look, I mean, when people approach me about, in America, everyone wants to know where you're from, or like how they always say to me, people say to me they know I'm a little off. They look at me, they know I'm a little off. They might look at you, Ralph, and they know you're a little off. They go, where are you from? And if you say like Massachusetts or Pennsylvania, that's not really the answer they're looking for, So I'll say to somebody, I'm from Philly or I'm from Detroit, and they'll say, no, where are you from? Because that's what white people say when they want to find out where you're really from. So where are you from? And I say, from Palestine. And I said that to a guy once in an airport, because, you're in an airport, you're alone. The flight was delayed. I'm sitting in the bar and, you just make friends with people. And he says, where are you from? And I said, oh, sorry, I'm from Palestine. And he looked over both of his shoulders and he looked back at me and he said, that's really cool. I said, why? He said, because I hate Jewish people too. Okay. Sometimes I bring out the racist in people. I don't mean to. Okay. And he said that to me. And I said to him, hey, man, that's racist. Okay. It's racist of you to assume that I'm a racist because of my race. That's racist. And he said, you mean you don't hate all Jewish people? And I just kind of whispered and I said, man, no, I'm just saying that's really racist. We have this schizophrenia, right? This weird thing that, like I said, we're very familiar with all the liberal Jewish voices that are for us, but it's kind of hard, and I talk about this as being Palestinian because 70 years of occupation messes you up. It's kind of hard to divorce your oppressor from his identity, especially when he uses that identity as one of the reasons he's oppressing you. So we're schizophrenic about it. So I always say that, right? If somebody asks a Palestinian, we don't know how to answer the question that they always ask us, do you hate Jewish people? Of course not. Do you like them? No, of course not. Like, we don't know what to say when we get asked the question. But the truth is we're the same, whether you're looking at Jews and Arabs or Jews and Muslims, they're the same. I mean, the fasting rules are the same. Jews got a better deal. They got a bargain. They only fast one day a year. Muslims are fasting a month, but whatever. We're both Semitic. We're hairy, big nose, crazy mom. It's the same thing. The only difference is they are chosen by God and we are chosen by the FBI. That's it. That's the only difference. And so these are the kinds of things I try to talk about on stage. And
Steve and Dave, jump in here. What would you like to talk about?
Well, I had a really bad taste. Steve, you go ahead.
No, you do your bad taste.
I
think so far this has been a red letter day because Ralph
go ahead, David.
As a comedian, and Amer told Ralph he looks like Jesus. So I think,
he's probably a little taller. He's probably a little taller. But if Ralph didn't shave for like 2 weeks, he'd look like Jesus for sure. For sure.
Don't tell General Motors that.
Yeah.
No. Look, I mean, this is what we deal with. It's funny because I'm sure Ralph has gotten this all the time, right? When you tell somebody that you're from the Middle East and you're a Christian, and then a lot of white people start to get this like glazed look over their eyes because they can't really compute all that, white, Middle East and Christian. And then my only answer to that is Jesus. I mean, just Jesus, didn't you go to Sunday school? They weren't talking about Nazareth, Pennsylvania. They're talking about Nazareth over there. And it's so funny. I mean, look, America's the dumbest country in the world, so we have to deal with that sometimes. Let me tell you something. If you want to understand any society, watch their game shows, okay? I don't know if you ever watched like a German or Japanese game show, but it's really the dumbest stuff you've ever seen in your life. It's adults like throwing eggs at each other, running through Jell-O. It's really stupid. Because a game show is an escape from your everyday reality. You've been doing what you're doing, and you just kind of want to watch a game show and escape from reality. Well, what are American game shows? Pick a letter and spell a word and then pronounce it. Or answer hard questions. Okay? We have a game show in America called Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? That's a game show. And if you win, you get $1 million. And guess what, Ralph? Nobody wins. All right? Nobody wins. Because in America, our escape from reality is intelligence. Right?
That's also because there's another reason, Amer. It's because they don't have a fifth grader on the show.
Well, that they've had 250 episodes, and only 2 people have ever won the show. One of them was a superintendent of schools of the whole state of Alabama. Okay, so she literally wrote the curriculum, and then the other person was a Nobel Prize winner in physics. These are the only 2 people to win. Are you smarter than a fifth grader? All right. If you want to understand anything about America, it's that. Go to Palestine and the kids are smart, but they're too smart. It's weird. It's a weird, psycho, crazy kind of smart. So I was in Palestine like 5 years ago, and I'm walking around the streets in Jerusalem, and a 6-year-old kid walks up to me and he goes, "You're from America?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Do you think that they will be able to pass Obamacare through the Congress?" I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? Go play soccer or something. But see, politics dominates their lives, right? So that's all they know. We watch the news. Ralph knows if you grew up in an Arab house, you watch the news. That's what you do. That is how you spend your time. It's a social activity in our houses, okay? And we make popcorn, we make coffee, we call our friends over, and we watch the news because we're on it. That is our TV. That's our TV show. Okay, that's like the only show that you'll turn on and you will see us all the time.
Well, we're getting a glimmer of Amer Zahr's humor, listeners, and we're almost running out of time. So, Steve and David, you want to pitch in anything here before we close?
David, what have you got?
Well, what I'm interested in is that you're making me laugh through the truth, but not like a traditional joke, which I find kind of interesting. How much of your comedy comes from love and anger and disappointment? I think that's where all great comedy comes from, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, my comedy comes from the ridiculousness that I live every day as an Arab or a Palestinian. I'm half Muslim. My dad is Christian. My mom is Muslim, both Palestinian. All these things together, right? I can just watch the news for like 15, 20. I mean, luckily, thank God, Trump is dominating the news right now. But if it weren't for Trump, if anyone else was president, most of the news headlines would be about Arabs and Muslims all the time. And you only need to watch for a few minutes to see the ridiculousness of what they do. Like when they arrested that kid in Texas for a clock, okay? Yeah. Okay, I mean, let's clear up a couple things about this kid, okay? His name is Ahmed Muhammad, which doesn't help, okay? I understand. That doesn't help, especially if you live in Texas. But he had a clock, Okay? He had a clock. And let me put on my law professor hat for a second. They tried to accuse him of a crime called a hoax bomb crime. All right? And that means it's a crime in America if you hold something up that's not a bomb and you say this is a bomb. That's a crime in America, and that should be a crime. You shouldn't be able to trick people into thinking you have a bomb. But it doesn't work for this little kid because he's walking around school all day saying, this is a clock. All right? He's just a nerd who likes his clock. And Fox News, don't watch Fox News if you don't have to, okay? I watch it for like scientific reasons just to see what would happen. And it turns out that it did happen, okay? But I have an uncle who can't speak English very well, and he doesn't call it Fox News. He calls it Cuss News, which, it's kind of true if you think about it. Fox News said, well, maybe they thought he had a bomb. Maybe they thought he had a bomb, so they had to arrest him because maybe they thought he had a bomb. But they didn't think he had a bomb. I know that they didn't think he had a bomb because that's not what they do when they think you have a bomb. When they think you have a bomb, they evacuate the school, right? Right? When they think you have a bomb, they call in the bomb squad, right? Right? They don't take you down to the principal's office with your bomb to talk to the principal. All right? It doesn't work like that. And I'm an Arab. I'm a Palestinian. I'm very familiar with bomb protocol. All right? And that is not what they do.
You raise an important issue, Amer. I've always thought that Trump basically is an anti-Semite against Arabs. Jim Zogby once gave a speech at an Israeli university called The Other Anti-Semitism, meaning there's anti-Semitism against Jews and there's anti-Semitism against Arabs. When he was campaigning in South Carolina, he went out of his way to attack two poor Syrian refugee families who had just settled legally in South Carolina. And then he has a ban on all Syrian refugees indefinitely coming from Syria. And he's always beating up on these fleeing Syrians and fleeing Arabs. Would you say there is a phenomena in this country that is basically describable as anti-Semitism against Arab people?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean when you say the term anti-Semitism against Arabs. Sometimes in our community, people say, Arabs are Semites too, so, we're victims of anti-Semitism, but I don't really believe that. I mean, anti-Semitism means what anti-Semitism means, which means anti-Jewishness. But there's no question that the same threads that were happening against Jews 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, all that time, is happening again against Arabs.
Exactly.
And there's also we can never lose the irony that that's what's happening in Israel. I mean, Edward Said talked about us Palestinians as the victims of the victims, right? And that is happening to us there. And there are many Jews who see that. And as Palestinians, we live it. But of course, I see that these things happen over and over again. Now, what I don't like hearing sometimes from people in our community or people in America is people saying, well, look, this happened to other people and now it's happening to you. Well, that's not good. That's not an excuse, and people say, well, it happened to the Native Americans. It's happening to the Palestinians. I don't want to be like the Native Americans who got exterminated and then ended up in reservations and basically have terrible, desolate lives, meant much of the time because of what America did to them. And people say, well, it happened to the Japanese and now it's happening to the Muslims. I don't want what happened to the Japanese to happen. They put them in internment camps. I don't want that to happen to us. So it's very important, right, to understand your history, but not to be like complicit in your history or to be complacent with it. So I do think that what's happening to Syrian refugees and Arabs and Muslims in America today is very reminiscent of what's happened to many groups, including Jews. And the irony of it, right, is that right-wing Jews in this country are all too willing to sort of live with this sort of rhetoric from Trump because they believe that he might be good for Israel, or they believe that he might let Israel sort of undertake its right-wing agenda, which of course is very, very damaging and very, very, I guess, ironic in some ways, because in fact the right-wing agenda will lead to one state and all of us, living under one flag in Israel, which I'm okay with, but I think you're going to find a lot of Jews not okay with. And in fact, there's this really interesting campaign happening in Israel right now where there are billboards. I was just there 2 months ago, and there are billboards, probably 50 of them throughout Israel, mostly in Tel Aviv, in Jewish neighborhoods that have a Palestinian flag, a crowd of Palestinians, and written in Arabic, pretty soon we will become the majority. And then there's a number that you call, okay? And if you call the number, actually left-wing Israelis pick up the phone and say, look, we better give the Palestinians a state, because if we don't, this is what's going to happen, all right? And look, they're right. But what you find, unfortunately, in Israel is that you have the left wing saying, look, let's give up 22% of Israel so that we don't have to live with the Palestinians. And the right wing saying, no, let's find a way that we can have 100% of Palestine and Israel, but let's still get rid of these people because we don't want to live with the Palestinians. Either way, they don't want to live with us, right? But they're going to have to get over that because we are not going anywhere.
On that note, we are out of time. How do people get in touch with you? And what if they want to invite you to come and perform, to use a limited term of the range of your intellect, perform in front of them as you go around the country?
Yeah, so I mean, my website is my first and last name, AmerZahr.com. That's AMER like America. That's what I tell white people. AMER like America. That's what I always tell the lady on the phone. How do you spell your name? AMER like America. In fact, my name autocorrects to America when people are sending me messages on my phone, so sometimes girls will send me messages like, hey, America, and then the romance kind of goes away. But so it's AmerZahr.com. That's where all my information is. People can get in touch with me there whenever they like. Of course, I'm on Facebook on my first and last name. Twitter is my first and last name. My blog is civilarab.com because, of course, we're not civil, right, Ralph? So I had to show everybody that we were. And so civilarab.com. I travel all around the country, perform all the time, a lot of community events, a lot of theaters. And I hope this summer to make it back to the Kennedy Center, Ralph, where I expect you to be in the front row watching a bunch of Arab comedians make people laugh. What do you say?
Waving your book, Being Palestinian, makes me smile. We've
Inshallah.
been talking with Amer Zahr. We've been talking with Amer Zahr, the author of the book, Being Palestinian Makes Me Smile. A lot of history in it, a lot of humor, a lot of irony. I urge you to get it. Thank you very much, Amer.
It's been an honor. Thank you.
We've been speaking with comedian Amer Zahr. We will link to his website and all related material at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll talk with labor journalist Steve Early about how residents of a small town in Northern California harness the power of local politics to reclaim their community. First, let's hear from corporate crime reporter Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, March 17, 2017. I'm Russell Mokhiber. From 2008 to 2015, Volkswagen sold 11 million diesel cars worldwide, rigged with software that cheated emissions tests by running the full emissions control system only if the car sensed a test was underway. Otherwise, the cars operated without emissions control, releasing more than 4 times the level of nitrogen oxides, a class of harmful pollutants. Now, scientists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology estimate that 1,200 people in Europe will die prematurely, each losing as much as a decade of life because of excess emissions from 2.6 million affected cars sold just in Germany. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan with David Feldman and Ralph. And now we turn our attention to the town of Richmond, California, and the story of how it transformed itself into one of the most progressive communities in the country. David?
Steve Early is an author and a journalist who has also been an organizer, lawyer, union representative, and labor activist. He has written extensively on topics surrounding labor, including his collection of essays, Save Our Unions, Dispatches from a Movement in Distress. His latest is entitled Refinery Town, Big Oil, Big Money, and the Remaking of an American City. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Steve Early.
Thanks for being here.
Yes, indeed. I first learned about Richmond, California when Gail McLaughlin, who worked on my 2000 presidential campaign in California, decided to enter politics in Richmond, which I understand is a little more than 100,000 population, and 3/4 of the population are minorities. And when she began her effort with others, a very small number of people in Richmond, nobody gave them a chance. This was a very poor town. I mean, it had all the indications of despair and poverty, and dominated by a giant oil company, the Chevron company, which had a refinery there. And your book, Refinery Town, shows what happened since 2000. And it really is a heartening story to similar towns all over the country and cities in terms of how they can begin the turnaround. You want to summarize your book before we go into some details? Steve Early.
Sure, Ralph. As you said, this is really an inspiring story of how citizen activists can come together, create a progressive organization that organizes around community issues year-round and also runs viable candidates for local office. Gail was one of our first candidates in 2004. She got elected to city council 2 years later, became mayor, and made Richmond for 8 years the largest city in the country with a green mayor. Since 2004, Richmond progressives have won 10 out of 16 races for city council and mayor. I think it's a one-loss percentage, probably better than any similar groups in the entire country. And during that period of time, they've succeeded in making the city safer and cleaner and greener and more equitable through a number of public policy initiatives.
And, of course, part of the story was challenging this dominant corporation, Chevron. Richmond, California, is not that far from San Francisco. And this was a corporation that wanted to basically continue its dominance and continue turning Richmond, California into a company town. What was that struggle all about?
Well, it's very much a struggle by the people, well organized at the grassroots against big money in politics. Chevron's linchpin of a conservative establishment coalition that also includes, not surprisingly, the Chamber of Commerce, the Association of Manufacturers, local developers, conservative building trades unions, and the police and firefighters. So that's a pretty powerful labor management coalition, dominated the politics of the city for many years. And over the last three election cycles, Chevron, Big Soda, last fall, the landlord lobby spent more than $7 million on local races trying to defeat progressive candidates. So the Richmond Progressive Alliance is, I think, a testament to what can be accomplished through building an organization that relies on small donors and volunteers and canvassing and door knocking and working year-round to overcome the influence of big money in politics.
The amazing thing is what made it happen was the power of individual votes aggregating around a redirection of priorities in Richmond, California, up against a combination, as you say, of a giant corporation, Chevron, some of the unions working there, as well as the Chamber of Commerce. So just to unravel how this began to happen, tell us about Chris Magnus.
Well, one of the things that Gail McLaughlin did as mayor and our very progressive city manager, Bill Lindsay, 12 years ago, was hire a new police chief. Richmond had a terrible record of police brutality, police department corruption, dysfunction. The city had been sued numerous times, had to pay out hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage settlements when people were beaten, roughed up, killed by the police. Police were 10, 12 years ago hassling the growing Latino community, setting up random checkpoints. There was no trust or confidence between the largely low-income population of Richmond and the police department that was supposed to protect that community. Chris Magnus, one of the few gay police chiefs in the country, was hired away from Fargo, North Dakota, of all places, one of the safest and whitest communities in the country. And over 10 years, he helped reduce the homicide rate. He helped redefine the job of a local police officer. He diversified the department and built relationships with the community that I think are a model for community policing everywhere else in the country.
Now, were the police required to live in Richmond?
That is still a controversial issue. No, it's not a requirement, but Chris Magnus, as chief, tried to set an example. He moved into the community. He bicycled to work. He encouraged other officers to live in the city. Most don't, but to his credit, the current head of the Police Officers Union takes advantage of a rare perk in Richmond. He lives rent-free in Richmond public housing, and Officer Ben Theriot is a very popular guy in that neighborhood, and I think a very good example of community policing.
Well, what's the community part of community policing in Richmond, California?
Well, we have a very important civilian initiative called the Office of Neighborhood Safety. It's funded both by the city and private grants, and this is an arm of city government that tries to reduce gang violence. It's still a major problem in Richmond. Gunfire claiming the lives of young people of color, turf warfare, drug trafficking, and Office of Neighborhood Safety is staffed by formerly incarcerated folks who've got gang experience. They do outreach in the community. They try to recruit young people into what's called the Peacemaker Fellowship Program. They get a $1,000 stipend for 9 months. They get job counseling and leads and other forms of support. And this particular program has had a high success rate in weaning people away from life on the streets that is a direct pipeline to incarceration.
Mm-hmm. And what have the reformers and the city government been doing about expanding employment for people?
Well, Richmond is a place where there's a lot of development opportunities. There's actually a major Chevron refinery modernization project that's underway where hundreds of building trades people from all over the state and country, in fact, are working on upgrading the refinery and hopefully making it somewhat cleaner and safer than it's been in the past. What the city council leadership has tried to do in dealing with developers and dealing with Chevron is negotiate what are called community benefits agreement, and included in those agreements is a commitment of local hiring to some degree in the area of housing developments to make sure that there's linkage fees that enable the city to build more affordable rather than just privately financed market rate housing. So job creation has really been in the area of the Chevron modernization project, new housing construction, and the city has developed as a kind of a hub for food preparation. There's a number of big catering firms that have located here recently. Not all green employment for sure, but more green jobs is the objective long term.
Well, municipal reform movements, we're talking with Steve Early, who's the author of the new book, Refinery Town, about Richmond, California. Steve, municipal reform movements throughout American history have often run out of steam. They go for a few years, they clean up some of the corruption, and then the established powers, corporate and otherwise, reassert their control. There are all kinds of corruption and procurement contracts and, the general trend that we've seen in municipal corruption. Is there stamina to this people's movement in Richmond? Is it on the defensive? Is there a counterattack? How are they institutionalized, what they're trying to do?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And this is definitely a local movement of what you might call long-distance runners, not sprinters. I mean, these are folks that have developed the patience and persistence and the willingness to study hard on local issues and get immersed in them, and that's a challenge. What the Richmond Progressive Alliance is doing now through the network known as Zahr Revolution that was set up by Bernie Sanders supporters after Bernie's presidential campaign last year is to do some lateral networking with other like-minded groups. There's a Berkeley Progressive Alliance. There's former Bernie supporters and Greens and other community activists and a lot of other neighboring communities that want to set up groups like the Richmond Progressive Alliance. So we're having a lot of meetings with them and exchanging information and encouraging people where the model is reproducible to try it in various forms. And there's tremendous interest now in going local. And when we have more allies in other communities, we're going to be able to deal more effectively with some of the limitations at the county and state level on municipal reform activity.
Now, has Richmond gotten publicity nationwide? Has it been on NPR, PBS, and the national newspapers? Because the key here is not just what's going on in Richmond, but Richmond being a lesson as to how to diffuse what they've done in Richmond in other cities and towns that have similar problems and can be encouraged by what occurred in Richmond.
Well, the press coverage actually has been very good, and it was reading it that encouraged me to write a book about the city's recent experiences. In 2014, there was a major showdown between Chevron and three progressives, including Gail McLaughlin, who were up for re-election. Chevron spent more than $3 million trying to smear Gail and her reform slate. The Chevron-backed candidates all lost, and that election showdown, David versus Goliath, for many people became a case study in post-Citizens United unrestricted corporate spending. Bernie Sanders came to town and helped us raise money and had a big town hall meeting Bill Moyers covered the election context. So, yeah, I think the money in politics part of the Richmond story has been widely covered, and the environmental issues involving Chevron, of course.
Well, your book has a foreword by Bernie Sanders, and listeners who want to take some heart for what's going on in Richmond, let me tell you, if you can do it in Richmond, California, given where they started, you can do it almost anywhere. You might want to pick up Steve Early's book called Refinery Town and connect with the sources that he has there. And how would they reach you, Steve?
Well, I have an author website, steveearly.org, and people can also email me directly, the letter L, the word support, lsupport at AOL.com. I'd be glad to hear from people interested in getting more information about the RPA or its experience in Richmond.
It's always good to have a model of superior performance out of great odds. And
winning is definitely better than losing.
That's for sure. Steve, David, you want to pitch in as we conclude this interview?
I just want to say, Steve, I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio. And can this kind of action that happened in Richmond be scaled up to a city of that size, which used to be a steel town and has been trying for decades to transform itself into, I guess, a service economy, but still hasn't found a new identity?
I think there are challenges in cities of larger scale. Having 110,000 people, having the ability to build a grassroots network rooted in neighborhoods, having so much face-to-face contact with people in city government is really helpful. You don't have here the anonymity, the huge bureaucracies that often confront would-be reformers in larger cities. But the challenges of living in a post-deindustrialization urban environment are very similar. I mean, like parts of Cleveland, Youngstown, Detroit, even Chicago, Richmond was devastated by manufacturers moving out in the late 20th century, leaving big industrial messes behind. The cleanup challenges here, both in terms of Superfund activity and just redeveloping space that was polluted and abused for so many years, I think it's a very similar challenges facing people in the Rust Belt cities of the Midwest.
Well, if listeners are in cities or towns that need this kind of turnaround, Steve Early's book would be a good living room discussion to get it underway, because it never takes more than 1% of the people representing majority opinion and needs to begin turning around the situation, even if it's challenging a giant company like the Chevron Corporation. Thank you very much, Steve Early, for giving us the time and giving a lot of people more than hope, but a expanding reality, people-based municipal government in Richmond, California, where you now live.
Thanks for having me on the show.
We've been speaking with Steve Early, author of Refinery Town, Big Oil, Big Money, and the Remaking of an American City. We will link to that and other writings by Mr. Early at ralphnaderradiohour.com. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, where we will hear a little bit more from Amer Zahr and Steve Early, and Ralph answers some listener questions. Welcome, podcast listeners, to the Wrap-Up, little odds and ends of conversations we had with Amer Zahr and Steve Early. Plus, Ralph answers some listener questions and then talks about the Trump budget. So here we go.
That bit about America, Amer?
Yeah.
Have you fleshed that out about the autocorrect?
Oh yeah, I've
That's great.
talked for a few minutes on it. It gets a little dirtier on stage, but yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
And Amer, I know why they took the kid in Texas down to the principal's office with the clock. They just wanted to match it up with Netanyahu's drawing of a bomb.
Yeah, I want to see if it fits. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, we've been speaking.
We could have gone on and on with David and Steve, but maybe we'll do it again.
Yeah, this was fantastic. This was great, Amer. Yeah, we should definitely do this again. And
let me say very quickly. Let me say one more thing very quickly, because I know you guys are going to edit some of this stuff around. So I'll just say this again.
Sure.
I made a documentary movie a few years ago called "We're Not White." because, as Ralph knows very well, the Census Bureau and the federal government considers Arab Americans as white people, and we're not. I wish we were. It seems awesome, but we're not. And we're not treated as white in any way. And there's been a move, and we don't know now where it's going to go with the Trump administration, to get Arabs a box or some sort of identification out of whiteness on the census form. But I made a documentary movie about it where I insert a lot of stand-up comedy, expert interviews, and man-on-the-street stuff. And it's been accepted to 4 film festivals so far. And it's called We're Not White. There's a Facebook page for it. And I'm happy to go around the country if anyone ever wants to have a showing of it. And they can have me and a showing. And I'd love to take it around the country, have discussions about it. But that's another project that I've worked on as well the past few years.
Funny, Amer, you look white.
And that's what they say. You know, people say to me, I look white, and I guess that's a compliment. I don't know, but you know, if I don't shave for a couple weeks, Ralph, I do not look white.
You don't have to shave your head.
No, I don't have to. Luckily, that's all gone. I always say my head has lost hair. The rest of my body has gained hair. I always say that my head is sort of like, my hair is Palestinians and my head is Palestine. Like they can't live there. They're being driven out of their homeland. They can live anywhere else, you know, but they can't live there. Like I have there's a refugee camp on my back. I have a whole refugee camp on my back, and there's some of them who have made it to like little refugee camps in Jordan, like on my ear, and like. But I mean, they can live anywhere, but they can't live there.
Amer, you haven't seen David's head. He's had some hair brought on chips.
The hair transplants.
Yeah.
They returned to their homeland. Yeah, right over.
Yeah. They've immigrated.
Those are the Jews. Those are the Jews going back to Israel.
Yeah, but they haven't assimilated.
No. That hair was there 2,000 years ago. I just returned it to its proper place.
That's right. God said that was your hair. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
I'm glad this wasn't on the program, but go ahead.
Well,
we'll do this again.
We'll do this on the after program.
Thanks, Amer. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks so much,
Amer.
guys. Have a great day.
Right.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
You know, the thing about comedy is, I try to explain this to my kids. Anybody who's smart and funny and well-educated, is inherently funny. You don't need to be a comedian or a comedy writer. Comedy writing
these days.
Yeah. Being a comedian is just all about abuse. Like, it's just the level of abuse that you endured.
Yeah.
And then after the Steve Early interview, he and Ralph got to talking about a campaign they did in the early 70s with truckers in Washington, D.C. called the Prod.
All right. Well, thank you so much again for having me on and reconnecting. I don't think we've talked since I was working for Prod.
Yeah, of course. I'll tell the guys what Prod was. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye, Steve.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Prod we organized truckers who were not being defended by the Teamsters when they were told to drive an unsafe truck on any given day by the employer. Listen to this. We got 1,200 truckers to come in with their trucks to Washington to protest. Can you imagine that happening today? They completely surrounded the city.
What year was this? Was this in the
probably
70s?
Early 70s?
The 70s. Wow.
And it challenged the Teamsters. It challenged the truck industry and the Teamsters. Well, you see how things have changed? Can you imagine getting 1,200 truckers on a safety issue?
Yeah. And now we had Ralph answer some listener questions. David, do you want to take this first one?
Okay. Ralph, this question comes from L.J. Abdul Hakim. Ralph, I've read your book, The 17 Solutions, Mr. Nader, and I thought it was great. However, I just have a slight concern about how cracking down on corporations may hurt employment for those working in them. Are there any good analysts looking at how government regulations affect the employment rate? Thanks so much. Good question.
Well, the cracking down usually is on polluters, banks that deceive and steal from their customers, insurance companies that unlawfully deny claims under policies. So, it doesn't really have an impact on employment. It just makes the corporations behave more honestly and comply with the law. Now, there are some real rackets, like deeply fraudulent garage repair shops, that end up being closed. by law enforcement. And, of course, that unemploys people. But overall, regulations that advance health, safety, and economic rights of people increase jobs. They increase the environmental equipment that has to be produced. Workers produce airbags, seatbelts, and this is a very, very favorable trend because the job production of these health and safety regulations so improve the quality, safety, and health of the American people.
I remember, Ralph, you telling us a while back about sort of the history of John Dingell, who was a congressman from Detroit for many, many decades, so-called protecting the auto industry from regulations in the 60s and 70s. And I think it was your observation that it actually in the long run hurt because by protecting them from safety and fuel efficiency regulations, that gave the opportunity for the Germans and Japanese to come in with safer, more fuel-efficient cars and sort of invade our market there.
That's a very important amplifying point on the question. Thousands of auto workers were laid off because the auto companies in Detroit and in the United States lost sales to more fuel-efficient Japanese and German cars. And that is another dimension where if you don't save these companies from themselves, they're going to lose out to their competitors from abroad, and there'll be more and more unemployed people in this country.
Well, very good. Thank you for that question, Mr. Abdul Hakim. Our next question actually isn't really a question, but it's an observation that I think, Ralph, you'll have some comment on. It's from Lloyd Hart. It came to us through the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Facebook page, and he says, he's talking about healthcare, and which is obviously a very timely subject right now. He says the assumption that market-based principles will bring health insurance rates down by creating more competition between private health insurers assumes that private health insurers are the principals of the healthcare industry, as opposed to the doctors, nurses, and hospitals that actually provide the care. This also deliberately distracts the public debate to insured, not insured, from the real argument of, quote, what's the best way to provide universal healthcare coverage that the Hippocratic Oath clearly calls for. The healthcare industry belongs to doctors, nurses, and hospitals, and not to the private health insurers or pharmaceutical companies. It is necessary for everyone to understand this as a starting point to negotiate rates. In Canada, doctors, nurses, and hospitals receive 79 cents of every healthcare dollar. Your comment, Ralph.
Well, that's an important distinction because when you hear reporters and others talk about the healthcare controversy, they're really talking about the health insurance payments controversy. There are two different situations. Mr. Hart makes a very important point, namely that every country in the Western world realized that if you leave healthcare coverage to the private market system, there are going to be a lot of deaths and avoidable injuries and sickness. When you have a pay or die market system, then the decision maker as to the result of that injunction is a profit-making corporation, not known for compassion, not known for foresight, not known even for efficiency, because they want to keep selling more and more of what is not necessary. Full Medicare for all, free choice of doctor and hospital. It's much more efficient, saves lives, has much more data aggregation to detect wrongful patterns that are emerging, and it covers everybody and reduces anxiety and family anguish and needless, maddening complexity in billing systems and trapdoor fine print in the contracts that the insurance companies and others foist on us. I think Canada is a good example. They cover everybody with less than half the per capita cost that we endure in our country, and we have tens of millions of people that are not covered or severely undercovered. So why don't we learn from Canada? Public funding of health care, private delivery of health care.
So in this new Republican health care bill, Ralph, is this just really, Paul Ryan and the rest being bought off by the health insurance industry?
And bought off by their own inebriation of power and ideology. This health care bill cuts severely Medicaid. According to the Congressional Budget Office scoring, it's going to lead to immediate loss of insurance, by 14 million people in this country, 25 million or so total by 2026. It's a huge tax cut for the wealthy. It eliminates protections for the elderly and increases the premium enormously for elderly people. And it sets the stage for corporatizing Medicare. I don't think it's going to get through, but it's part of the overall Trump budget Death Star that was released a few days ago. And it is the most extreme, vicious, cruel, devastating budget involving cuts that are going to cost loss of life in this country, loss of life abroad in terms of humanitarian aid to famine areas, and it has to be stopped. And I believe that the American people will begin to say enough is enough, and will continue to fill those congressional town meetings or create their own town meetings and summon their senators and representatives to them and block this budget and begin a turnaround that brings the best out of our country. Wait till you see this budget. It's a total mad dog budget.
That concludes our wrap-up. For all you podcast listeners, please share this link. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
A transcript of this episode will be posted on RalphNaderRadioHour.com.
For Ralph's weekly blog, go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to CorporateCrimeReporter.com.
Remember to visit the country's only law museum, the American Museum of Tort Law in Winsted, Connecticut. For more information, go to tortmuseum.org.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin.
Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Stay tuned, and we'll talk to you then, Ralph.
Thank you very much, David and Steve. And listeners, whatever you do, pay attention to the consequences of the Trump budget, the most devastating federal budget ever proposed, because we have to stop it in Congress.